So now let's look at some specific civilizations, especially India, China, and Islam, and see how they created world orders and what relevance it might have for contemporary international relations, if any. So, the Indian civilization has a long history, but there is also, it's not a continuous history. So, the first Indian civilization, that is also called the Indus Valley civilization, and because it's on the banks of the Indus River. And today it's based, the ruins of the civilization can be found in today's Pakistan as well as India. And the periodization is a bit uncertain, but 4000 BC to about 1900 or second millennium BC. It could have been, it might be the first urban civilization of the world. We know there were previous civilizations like Sumerians and Egyptians, although the Indus Valley can coincide in terms of time period with both of them. But it's more urban than the Egyptian or Sumerian civilizations. This is seen from the archaeological digs and the ruins, and you will find that the location of the Indian civilization and the excavations from some of the major locations or ruins of that civilization, particularly Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, which is now in Pakistan, they show a very urban construction or composition or urban features of the civilization. So you will see things like buildings made of burnt brick, sanitation facilities, swimming pools, roads, and but one interesting thing is no real monuments. You don't have any evidence of palaces or big temples. So that can tell you that it's urban, and also it's not sort of the traditional monarchical type civilization where we had a strong ruler or emperor or king. Now, knowledge of the civilization is incomplete. The script of the civilization has not been deciphered, but at least most historians who study this think it was an urban civilization, and it had it was a society of equals, so to speak, not hierarchical, because we don't find any monuments. If there was an emperor or a king, they would have left big temples, big palaces, and such things have not been discovered. But what has been found is public paths, roads, and buildings made of burnt brick and the like. So while not much is known about this, still one can make conjectures about it, this kind of urbanity of the civilization. Then India has republics. This is after the middle of the second millennium BC, when we have the so-called migration of, or some people call it invasion of Aryan people from Central Asia, Asia Minor to India. And most Indians today claim their descent from these Aryans. But there were also original people of India who were pushed to the south by this Aryan invasion. But once these people settled, while the Indus Valley civilization was on the bank of Indus River, the people who were called Aryans from Central Asia and Asia Minor, they settled under the Ganges River, around the Ganges River. So Ganges River plays a similar role to what the Yangtze and the Huanghe, the Yellow River played, especially the Yellow River played in Chinese civilization. And these are the republics of India. There are not monarchies. So that's a very important point here, that this idea of a republic is not just confined to Greece or other places. India also had republics. And they're not democracies, they're also oligarchies. But there was no direct line of descent from person to person, like the child, the son or daughter of a ruler became the ruler after his or her death. And even if you see Buddha himself was a prince of one of these republics. And the most powerful republic was Magadha, which became the seat of the first empire of India, which is the Mauryan Empire. Just like the Qin, they were kind of one of the warring states, and they become hegemonic by defeating all of the states of that period in ancient China. In India also we had a bunch of republics. They're not fighting quite as much as the warring states of China, but they certainly had ultimately led to the hegemony of Magadha, which is in current Bihar. So India made a transition from republics to an empire, just like China would make a transition from the warring states to the first empire. India therefore had a mixed internal system, or mixed world order, you can call it, between anarchy and empire. The republics were anarchic. There is no central power overruling them. But then Magadha conquers them under Mauryas, and it becomes the empire. It had monarchies and republics. So again, diversity within the same civilization. The first empire in 321 BC, before the Roman Empire, which was in the first century AD, and also the first Chinese Empire, which was a little later. India also had a coexistence of both realism and idealism. So this is represented by two Indian personalities. Realism was represented by Kautilya, very well known in international relations theory these days, especially realists. Some people call him the Indian Machiavelli, although it should be the other way around, because he was he was presenting he was offering his views at least 1,500 years before Machiavelli in Florence. So realist thought is similar to the Chinese. Will have the legalists, but there are differences. But it's realist in the same way, that how to defeat your enemies through war, spying, alliances, and conquest, but at the same time maintain welfare and happiness of their own people. Kautilya was also the first person to give a detailed description of elements of state. It was entirely secular, by the way. It's not religious. So you find that Western scholars often think India and all these Oriental civilizations are too religious. And they always say everything is about God creating this. But this Kautilya, his science of statecraft, wrote a book called the Arthasastra. It was entirely secular. It was all about defeating your enemy and spying, alliances, and how the king can become an emperor, how to increase your power. He was not a believer in keeping countries independent. He was prescribing imperialism. And we find that, that Machiavelli was trying to do that to the Borgia family. The Chinese legalists helped to bring about the first empire, legitimize the first empire. So it was also secular. Like in China, it was almost entirely secular, especially the legalist thinking. And there was also in India idealism. So idealism, realism coexisted. And in the same, in India, just like in China, warring states, you have the Confucians and the legalists. So idealists and realists. And there are other kinds of thinking, the Mozu and others. Same in India, you have idealists. And even in the same period, the Maurya period, you have Kautilya and you have King Ashoka. He was close to an emperor, King Ashoka. King Ashoka is very famous in Buddhism, by the way. He is the one who promoted Buddhism to Southeast Asia and also to China. In fact, you have an Ashoka temple, King Ashoka temple in China, not in Shanghai, Ningbo, King Ashoka's temple. And he sent missionaries to preach Buddhism to Southeast Asia and through Southeast Asia. His missionaries also came to China. But his main contribution to political thinking, political thought, international thought, was the doctrine of righteousness. So Ashoka actually was started off as a conqueror, and he was influenced by Kautilya. He invaded a lot of countries which were independent, including this little state called in Bay of Bengal, called Kalinga. You don't see this here, this map, but it was somewhere here. It was independent. And sorry, this is going back to Indus Valley. I should go to this one. Which was independent. And after the conquest, there was a record of this in inscriptions, his inscriptions. So 100,000 people died, another 100,000 were taken prisoners. And so the king was overcome with regret, and he converted to Buddhism, and then started what is called doctrine of moral conquest, as opposed to physical conquest. And he's considered the greatest king of India ever. And his doctrine is called Dharma, which in Sanskrit simply means righteousness. And so some of his writings tell us about his attitude towards other states and also attitude towards his own people. So the people of the unconquered territories beyond the borders might think, what is the king's intention towards us? My only intention is that they live without fear of me, that they may trust me, and I may give them happiness, not sorrow. So, assuming that there is an element of propaganda in this, but he never conquered another state after the last conquest, which got him invasion of Kalinga, 261 BC. Kalinga actually is the state where I grew up. It's now called Odisha in modern India. And after that, there was no record of any conquest. And there was this doctrine of Dharma telling the neighbors not to fear his intention and trust him. Very different from Kautilya, who was always advising the king to conquer and by spying or war or any means. So it's a doctrine of morality, whereas the other one is the doctrine of realism. And human rights, I don't know that I can call it human rights, but certainly there was a sense of protecting people and protecting them from cruel and unjust punishment. So while being completely law-abiding, some people are imprisoned, treated harshly, and even killed without cause, so that many people suffer. The judicial officers of the city may strive to do their duty, and that the people under them might not suffer unjust imprisonment or harsh treatment. So when you talk about human rights today, we talk about protection against unjust, cruel punishment, like death penalty, for example, or torture, and without any cause. So here is a statement that you can read it in different ways. I mean, it's not like you can sue the emperor in court those days, but certainly there was an idea that people should not suffer from unjust imprisonment or harsh treatment, which is another reason why you can see that the human rights as a concept has multiple origins. Some of them came from Europe after the Magna Carta, when the landed aristocracy wanted its property rights to be secured against king's encroachment, and then they negotiated a statement or a concession from the king that's called Magna Carta. That's many people think that was the foundation of human rights. But here is human rights in another form. That when you have an idea that the government should not imprison or treat people harshly, and acknowledgement that such things do happen, that people are imprisoned or treated harshly or killed without cause. So you find that in other civilizations too. So therefore, human rights today has multiple origins. It's not just Western in origin. It's very arrogant to say that it only started. There is a particular kind of human rights, property rights, that maybe have European origin, where you could actually. But you can say that when the Magna Carta was created, the English lords and the serfs and the feudal chiefs asserted the right against the king. Well, if the king took away the property, what can they do? It's just a statement by the king, concession. So the enforcement was also very weak in Europe at that time. And you can say that, well, this is a statement from the king and in India, and it can be also not enforced at that time. But the fact is that there is such a statement becomes part of law, part of the legal tradition, part of the moral tradition, part of the norms. If not a law, it's a norm. And why shouldn't we also take this into account when you think of human rights, rather than say human rights always came from entirely from the West? The human rights proponents today make the mistake. They arrogantly say it all came from the West and everybody else would accept it. Instead of saying that it actually has multiple origins and every civilization created this body of human rights and protection, therefore it belongs to all of us. That's a better way of selling a concept than say, wow, the Europeans invented it, but everybody should accept it. So that was Indian contribution. And another thing about India is rationalism and spiritualism. Indian religion has both elements, just like every civilization. So we credit Greeks of being rational or inventing rationalism. Rationalism simply means explaining causation without referring to God, that God created everything, as opposed to saying nature created. There are natural processes and natural laws, and that can actually... So the universe has a natural origin, natural elements, as opposed to God creating it. Now, Greeks thought about natural law, natural causation, but so did Indians. In India, there was always two traditions, just as in Greece. In Greece, Plato believed in the soul, Aristotle believed in natural causations. In India, you had some philosophical schools who did not acknowledge God, and some who did. There is a philosophy called Sankhya in India, which was totally atheist. But there were also other elements, the Brahminism, which was everything was caused by God. You find that also in Islam. Some Islamic scholars revived Aristotle, we'll come back to that, and said the universe is eternal. God did not create the universe. The universe pre-existed the God. The Christians didn't like that, because Christian Catholics believe in divine creation. In the beginning there was darkness, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. But Aristotle and people inspired by Aristotelian thinking challenged that, including some Muslims. We'll talk about that. So Islamic civilization also has a rational element. Chinese civilization has rational elements. Taoists are very nature-oriented. They think nature itself has its own causation, own rhythm. So again, the point I'm trying to make is that every civilization has different elements. But we stereotype that the Eastern Oriental civilizations are all about beliefs in God, and the Western civilizations are all rational. It is not true historically. And then I talked about Indianization and Hellenization. Indian ideas spread to Southeast Asia, to Central Asia, China, including Buddhism, Hinduism, but also political institutions that came with it. And political institutions are very critical in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, basically, with the exception of Vietnam, which was very Chinese in its institutions. Vietnam was, was colonized by since from the Han Dynasty until the Song Dynasty. The first millennium AD, Vietnam was a Chinese protectorate, actually a colony. And where Chinese institutions like the centralized bureaucracy, this mandate of heaven, something similar to those institutions, were found in Vietnam, but only northern Vietnam. Southern Vietnam, which is today Saigon and that area, Champa civilization, Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, they all had Indic political ideas and institutions, again based on universal kingship and legitimized by Hinduism and Buddhism. And those ideas spread entirely peaceful. There are no records to date of Indian conquest. The Indian king sent soldiers, conquered them, and converted them to Hinduism, Buddhism, and imposed the institutions. It was done very peacefully, unlike Alexander and his conquest of these places and the creation of Hellenistic kingdoms. So the comparison between Indianization and Hellenization tells us something about how ideas spread in different ways, and India provides the model of peaceful diffusion of ideas. So this is a summary of Indian contribution to international relations, thought and practice. But the key element is diversity, plurality, and not stereotyping India as one kind of civilization and Greece as another kind of civilization. It's the coexistence of rationalism and spiritualism, realism and idealism, and anarchy and empire, anarchy and hierarchy. And you look at also, I'm sure there are some Indian ideas that spread by within what is today's India, the Aryan invasion. Well, a lot of people think it was not an invasion, but a very forceful mass migration. Even if we assume there were violence and displacement there, but largely the story is peaceful spread of ideas, and especially to Southeast Asia. So that's Indian contribution. China starts in some ways earlier and some ways later, but also similar in many ways. China also had warring states, anarchy, and it became an empire. The Qin dynasty, 221 BC. Before that, a bunch of old states. And this is a good way to look at it. How the Qin dynasty, this picture you see, 4 different stages of the warring states. So 453, Qin was a small little red country, and with a very competitive relationship with other states like Chu, for example, or Yan, for example. And then Qin expands and starts to expand its territory, then becomes larger and larger, and 221 BC takes over its smaller neighbors and makes China a unified empire. The Chinese call it unification, the first unification of China. But in political science and international relations, we can simply say a transition from anarchy to a universal empire. And again, China has both the traditions, anarchy and hierarchy. China also has a mix of idealism and realism. Idealism will be Confucianism, Taoism to some extent, and realism is represented by legalism. And legalism was kind of the ideology behind the Qin conquest of or unification of China. Then this idea of Tianxia, all under heaven, which no matter how we interpret it, whether there was a real heaven, whether it was a self-serving doctrine, but it's basically it's a normative concept, non-exclusive world order, very different from Westphalian model of a independent, sovereign, territorially coherent states balancing each other. So Chinese concept Tianxia, which actually predates the warring states, goes back to the Zhou dynasty. During the warring states period, Zhou was a small little weakened state among many others. But the Tianxia concept continued to influence Chinese thinking and worldview. And now it has come back in a kind of big way in the late 20th, early 21st century. A lot of people are talking about Tianxia in China these days, both scholars and some policymakers. Then the Chinese major innovation was the tributary system. Now, many other empires also have tributary relationships. The Roman Empire has a tributary system. Indians have a tributary system. So a tributary system is a suzerain system, not a sovereign system. When you have other countries paying respect, acknowledging your superiority, but without giving up their sovereignty, without being part of your empire. But the Chinese tributary system was the most advanced form of this. Nobody perfected this tributary relationship as well as China did. And again, it was long-lasting. It might have started from Han Dynasty and it ended with the Qing Dynasty. And it's kind of a halfway between total anarchy and hegemony. Hegemony means the rule of one country or empire, and anarchy means decentralized. Everybody for everyone for itself. A system of independent states competing with each other. This is hierarchy in between anarchy and hegemony, where you acknowledge the cultural superiority, at least, of a leading power, and this was China. And China can offer the benefits of trade, recognition, protection without colonizing other states. Now, if you look at the role of China in Southeast Asia, the tributary system was not just about trade, by the way, or mainly about trade. It's also about political recognition. So, if, for example, you have a kingdom or a little kingdom in Malaysia or Myanmar, and the king dies and two brothers fight for the control over the throne. And one brother manages to prevail over the other, but has no legitimacy because they were fighting and it was decided in battle. So they will send a mission to China to gain recognition from the Chinese emperor that this person is the legitimate king, a ruler of China. The emperor will give a kind of a document and a scroll, and that will be read, and the dispute is settled. It's like the United Nations system of the classical period. Now you cannot be a state without recognition from the United Nations as a state. The Chinese emperor played that role in the tributary system. Many examples of this. When there is a change of ruler in a country in Southeast Asia, or I don't know much about Northeast Asia, but certainly I know about Southeast Asia, the Chinese emperor will settle that dispute without sending any force, just a simple statement. Because China's influence was backed by prestige, a superior civilization, not necessarily by military force. China did not conquer any of these countries. Only in the 15th century, China sends a fleet under Admiral Cheng Ho to kind of pacify the tributary system, sow the flag, so to speak, not to impose colonialism. But before that, China did all this kind of protection role. There was 15th century, there was a strong rivalry between the king of Malacca or the Sultan of Malacca. Malacca was a small kingdom, small but very powerful city-state in the Malayan coast. And Siam, which is current Thailand, was a much more powerful state. And the king of Siam always tried to take over Malacca. And Malacca was protected by China because the Sultan of Malacca, Malacca was an Indian kingdom whose king converted to Islam, but it hosted Admiral Cheng Ho's fleet. Because every time you go through the Straits of Malacca, you have to stop there. That's where the wind direction changes. The monsoons change the direction. You have to wait there until the wind becomes favorable for you to take your ships to back to your own country. So Malacca had this entrepot trading hub of 15th century, and Malacca was always being attacked or provoked by Siam. So the Chinese emperor wrote a letter to the king of Siam, said, hands off Malacca, that you should trade with each other. Trade will bring prosperity to both of you, whereas war will bring disaster to both of you. And Malacca is protected by the celestial kingdom, which is China. You should not covet Malacca, should not destroy. And that thing helped. So the Chinese emperor was able to play all these roles. Although in the 15th century there was a Chinese fleet of the Ming dynasty sailing through 6 times to Southeast Asia, but there was no real, there was a little bit of Chinese intervention in Ceylon and in Sumatra, but really it was nothing like European colonialism, and colonial powers came, and the same Malacca became the first territory of Southeast Asia to fall to European colonialism, 1511. Malacca becomes the first Southeast Asian state to fall under European colonial rule. The Portuguese conquered Malacca. But throughout the 15th century, 1400, early 1400s to late 1400s, Malacca was an independent state, but under the Chinese tributary system is very prosperous, more prosperous than Venice, and a hub of trade under Chinese protection without being a Chinese territory. So the tributary system applied to Japan, applied to Korea, and there's a lot of controversy about it. Some people say it's Chinese imperialism, but it was not really. To look at it objectively, very different from European imperialism, which came later. So very different from Roman imperialism. Rome, basically, both Rome and China were similar in terms of having relatively preponderant power over their neighbors, but at the same time providing public goods, meaning security and trade, free trade, or freedom of seas. The Roman Empire was also credited with pacifying the Mediterranean and creating more and more trade, which benefited everybody. And that's true. The Roman Empire did that by conquering the entire Mediterranean. If you look at the Roman Empire, entire Mediterranean was a Roman lake. Whereas the Chinese tributary system was not really based on conquest. It was based on this indirect tributary relationship. So just like we compare the Greek spread of ideas, spread of Greek ideas called Hellenization with Indianization, and see one was backed by force and resulted in displacement of locals. The other one was not backed by force and did not result in displacement of locals, but actually empowerment of the locals. The Chinese tributary system in the Roman Empire, one was built by force, brutal force. You provide public goods, you pacify, you provide trade, security, all that benefits to the Roman Empire. But the price to pay is conquest, being part of the Roman Empire. In the Chinese case, you had trade, you have security, but you didn't have to be part of the Chinese Empire, with some exceptions, like Vietnam for the first 1,000 years of the first millennium AD. So you can see the Chinese created also global trade, the beginnings of global trade through the land Silk Road, going from basically from Western China, Xi'an, Chang'an, to Constantinople, which was the seat of the Eastern Roman Empire, and then the Maritime Silk Road, which again came from southern part of China, Guangzhou, Hangzhou, but especially Guangzhou being the key port, but also the Fujian coast, very, very important, to Southeast Asia, through Southeast Asia to India. Admiral Cheng Ho actually died off the Kerala coast in one of his voyages, and then go all the way to Africa and the Middle East. It was a mission of sowing the flag rather than imperial mission. None of these countries. There is some case of intervention in Sri Lanka, Ceylon, and Sumatra, but generally they could have. China had the power those days to take over some of these small states. If China wanted to take over Malacca, by the way, they would have just done it like that. There's no comparison, but they didn't. They protected the King of Malacca against the neighbors like Siam, but left Malacca independent. So very different from Roman Empire. So you can compare Roman Imperium with Chinese world order or Chinese tributary system. You find that there are echoes of the difference between Hellenization and Indianization in the ideational domain. Just as Hellenization and Indianization differed in ideationally, the Roman Empire and the Chinese system differed materially in terms of geopolitics. So again, you get a feel that if you bring the Chinese civilization and Indian civilization into the picture, the history of the world, how we talk about internationalism changes. And China technological innovation, the Grand Canal, started with the Sui dynasty, a major innovation of the classical period, like the Belt and Road of classical times, and had the site of the first industrial revolution, especially during the Sung dynasty, But throughout history, China was the inventor of compass, paper printing, and of course gunpowder. And this was really the first industrial revolution, well before the European Industrial Revolution. World's leading economy for 1,000 years, unquestionably. And if you look at contemporary world order and think about how we got here, and we say everything started with Europe. These inventions of China had a major influence on Europe, especially invention of gunpowder, invention of compass. The compass was perfected by the Muslims, but it was invented in China. Arabs actually developed navigation. They were much more of a maritime country. China was never really a maritime power. It was only in the 15th century it had a big fleet. But on the early part, first half of 15th century, it was basically a continental power, Eurasian power, whereas Arabs were out and out, always maritime, and they contributed a lot to maritime trade. But the Chinese contributed to trade generally, but through innovation, they helped Europe to build its greatness later on. So, especially paper money, and printing. There were major innovations. Silk, we talk about silk and porcelain, but those are kind of luxury items. Chinese silk was not really a major factor in the rise of Europe. Indian cotton was. India actually was the largest supplier of cotton in the world, and it basically created the first consumer revolution in Europe, because for the first time, Europeans can afford cheap clothes. Before cotton came from India, the British consumers either had the option of silk or flax. One is too rich, silk, or flax is too poor. And you have wool, which is very difficult to maintain. Cotton gave them enough cotton clothing. Everybody can have cheap clothes, plenty. So you can actually have real clothes. And that created the first consumer revolution. India was the biggest producer of cotton in the world, and the biggest supplier of cotton fabrics. And the British, when they found out, they started growing cotton in different parts of the world, including the Americas, in the American South, and they imposed high tariffs on Indian cotton, and they banned the import of Indian cotton for several decades. So within a few decades, Indian cotton industry disappeared, and Britain becomes the leading supplier of cotton in the world. So imperialism played a direct role, and British historians have a hard time accepting it. But the fact that imperialism basically gave them an edge, especially in the one area where Britain was British consumer revolution, and even the industrial revolution started on the back of Indian cotton. Silk was less important to Britain or Europe. It was a luxury item. Everybody loved silk, but common people could not afford it, so to speak. But anyway, China provided ideas, inventions, and also the land Silk Road, overland Silk Road, and also, so in terms of contributed to European civilization, but at the same time provided an alternative world order through the tributary system and through its Tianxia concept to the Westphalian anarchical model, or the Roman imperial model. At the same time, China was not a monolith. China had idealism and realism, China had rationalism and otherworldliness, superstition, and also China had empire and republics. So we also need to know about China to understand contemporary world politics. So these days, people talk about China. They say some people, especially in the West, think the Chinese are going to recreate the tributary system, like in the past. Or Tianxia is seen as a kind of Chinese imperialism by some critics. But the fact is that the history doesn't repeat itself. The use of history really is to give you an idea of alternative possibilities. And some of them may recreate itself, but history never really, that's a mistake to think that you have a historicism. That's called historicism. When you think the past will always reappear as present, or history repeats itself. I think that's mostly wrong. But history does tell you that there are some recurring patterns and alternative possibilities of what you have in present. And you should be aware of that. So even if the tributary system, I don't think that China is trying to recreate a tributary system, but there will be some elements of it that might tell you that China is not the same kind of civilization as others. And you should be alert to the possibility that in a period when China is rising again, there's nothing surprising about that, because as I said, China was the number one economy in the world until the 18th century. So there's nothing surprising that China can become number one economy again in the world. One should not be so shocked. But as they become number one, they might, the world has to understand about Chinese history, has to understand characteristics or attributes of a world order that China created. So people like Henry Kissinger are sensitive to that. But most of the people see it as a kind of either totally false or totally negative. Instead of saying that this is an alternative form of a world order and it's not going to reappear, but it will influence Chinese thinking. Because China itself now believes in the Westphalian system, believes in sovereignty and non-intervention. It's not going to recreate the tributary system. It will be also politically counterproductive. It's not going to be accepted by Japan or India or United States. So China is not trying to create that, either out of necessity or being pragmatic about it. But at the same time, you cannot completely dismiss it as irrelevant or simply as a kind of China trying to become imperialistic again. So that is Chinese contribution. India's case is a little similar, by the way. India is not trying to bring back Indian world order either, much less so than any people think. People in the West worry less about Indian imperialism because it's not a world number one country. It's not trying to be world number one. Indian narrative is not about becoming globally number one. It's basically maintaining itself as a politically and culturally diverse country. So India doesn't create the kind of fear as China does in the Western mind. But at the same time, the Indian Prime Minister sometimes talks about, Narendra Modi talks about Indian past, Indian scriptures, Indian classical civilization, and it creates some sort of nervousness in the West about that. But again, India is not going to recreate the Maurya dynasty or Maurya Empire or the Mughal Empire. But again, you have to understand that India's sense of diversity and past is going to be part of this construction of an identity. This was in India. Before there was a unity of India, there was a culture of India, and also some of the ideas of India, like this idea of religious tolerance of King Ashoka, or human rights, proto-human rights I talk about, which one can see from his thinking, or Kautilya's realism. They are very relevant ideas. They're no less or no more relevant than, say, Machiavelli of Italy or Thucydides of ancient Greece. To the extent that we talk about Thucydides' trap or Machiavellianism, Aristotle, when we think about the doctrines of Ashoka and the realpolitik, moral doctrine of Ashoka, or the realpolitik of Kautilya, or Chinese, in the case of China, the realpolitik of the legalists and the idealism of Confucians. We should give them the same treatment, by the way. They are no less universal than Western doctrines. The Greek city-states and Aristotelian thinking, Plato's ideal republic has never materialized. That's another irony. We give so much emphasis to Plato and his idea of a republic. There has never been a republic in real world. But the Indian ideas of Kautilian state or Chinese ideas of tributary system are real. They actually have materialized. And the thing is, that's why they are important to be studied. So I want to go to now Islam. By the way, this is a picture of the ship of Columbus, Santa Maria, lead ship, and Admiral Cheng Ho's fleet. You can see the comparison of size and structure. And tell you the relative technological capacity of the two civilizations, the European and the Chinese. Yes. I'll come back to it. Leave your questions. Leave your questions. So I want to go to Islam now. In the case of Islam, the key to remember is much bigger in scale than either China or India. So at one point, Islam conquered a vast chunk of Eurasia, North Africa, and extended from Europe, Spain to Indonesia. It's a much bigger geographic entity than either China or India. But it was also diverse and pluralistic. Islam never had a central empire that controlled the whole Islamic world. It had pockets of empire. There was a Mughal Empire in India, there was the Ottoman Empire, there was the Caliphates of Baghdad, and also Western Caliphate in Spain, the Egypt under Islamic rule, but they were decentered. It's a decentered civilization, politically speaking. But they were unified by religious belief of Islam, Islamic religion. But if you look at the real contribution of Islam, the main thing to remember are these. First, it was a successor. It's a bridge between the classical and modern period. So Islam is later than Hinduism or Buddhism or Christianity. It's only in the 7th century that Islam appeared as a religion. So compared to Judaism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam is a latecomer, which is exactly why it was able to bridge the ancient world with the modern world. And because it came from the Arabian Peninsula, which is in the center between Europe and Asia, it was geographically located to play the role of as a successor and a bridge. It was a successor to the classical civilizations of India, China, Persia, Persian Empire, Persian civilization, and it preserved a lot of their ideas and transmitted them to the later period. It was also a bridge between the classical and modern period. So this was seen pretty much in the House of Wisdom, which is a center for translation and transmission of knowledge in Baghdad in the 8th century and AD, when the classical Greek knowledge began disappearing or fragmenting because of the fall of Alexandria. And initially it was by the Roman invasion, and then of course the Roman Empire moved to Constantinople. Alexandria survived a little bit, but when the Islam rose as a civilization, Arabs also attacked Alexandria, and the first attacks led to further destruction of Alexandria and its library. But the second caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, they decided that this repertoire of knowledge, Greek knowledge, is too valuable. And for whatever reason, even for their own self-benefit, they learned from the Greeks to empower themselves, or a genuine quest for knowledge. The Caliphate in Baghdad preserved it, or sought to preserve it, by translating a lot of these documents into Arabic, and hiring translators, collecting documents, building a library. So that was the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. And in the 8th century, the greatest collection of knowledge in the world of that time, of astronomy, medicine, geography, and philosophy. Quite a bit of this was Greek, including philosophy, books of Aristotle, but also Chinese and Indian, in particular a lot of Indian texts and Persian texts are translated here. That's why the numeral system, the fact that the world now uses 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 8, 7, 8, 9, 10, as opposed to the Roman numerals, is because of translations done in Baghdad, where the Arabs extracted imported Indian numerals and then called them Arabic numerals. And then the Europeans accepted that. The idea of zero, the figure 0 is an Indian invention, mathematics. And that again came to Baghdad, and without 0, we would not have computation and physics or mathematics. So the House of Wisdom played a transmitter of knowledge between the Persian Indian civilization and to the Western civilization. Because what happens is the Arabs translate Greek knowledge and from others. Then, of course, they conquer Spain, which is on the western side. It's an European country. And they also create a caliphate there. And they also set up translations there. And some of the Christian kings, especially of Sicily, got interested in acquiring Arabic knowledge. And through Arabic knowledge, the old extant texts of Greeks, which would have been otherwise lost. Some of the Greek texts, including that of Aristotle that we have today, only survive in Arabic translation. Very similar to what happened to Buddhism, by the way. A lot of Buddhist texts in India were lost. Buddhism disappears in India almost. But they survive in Chinese translation. So some of the great scriptures of Buddhism, which originally were Indian, now only exist in Chinese translation. Then you can retranslate back to Indian language in English. Similarly, some of the Greek texts of medicine or philosophy that we have today were retranslations. They were translated into Arabic, then from Arabic to Latin or French. Otherwise, they would have been lost. That's called circulation of knowledge, not class of civilization. And the Arabs also helped with innovation. They just simply not translate and preserve like a library. They also interpreted. They advanced on Greek knowledge. To give you an example, the Greeks are not very good in experimentation. They're good in abstract theoretical things. But Arabs are good in experimentation, using instruments. So that was a big advance. And when you look at philosophy, Greek philosophy, very important. Again, just sort of foundation of rationalism. But the Greeks are conquered by Romans, and Roman Empire was initially pagan, influenced by Greek ideas. Then it converted to Christianity. And once you become Christianity, you don't believe in natural creation anymore. You believe in divine creation. God created everything. The Catholics are very strict about it. And from that period to the medieval period, which is Dark Ages in Europe, until the Renaissance, 14th, 15th century, Catholics, the Pope had basically very strict line about this, that you cannot question the doctrine of divine creation. But Aristotle has propounded the doctrine of eternal creation, doctrine of the eternity of the world, which means God did not create the universe. There was a universe which is eternal. It was created by natural forces. Two very powerful competing ideas. There is no rationalism in the world today without the doctrine of eternal creation. The doctrine of eternal creation has disappeared from the Greek world. It has survived in translation and in the minds of Muslim philosophers. So Muslims created, Arabs created philosopher. This is their philosophy. Some of it was Greek, some of it was advancing on Greek. So this guy, Ibn Rushd, which is a Moroccan Muslim philosopher, he's called the Arab Aristotle. He was particularly knowledgeable about Aristotle. He wrote dozens of commentaries on Aristotle. And in particular, he revived and expanded on doctrine of eternal creation. He was challenging his own religion, by the way, because the Muslim Orthodox religion also doesn't believe in this. Neither do the Christians. So you are taking on both his own religion and the religion of the Christians. And he said, he sort of found a middle ground. Yeah, God is important. God gave a push to eternal creation. But there was something called eternal creation. And who benefits from that? People in Europe who are fighting the Catholic Church. The first universities in Europe are built in Italy, but especially in Paris and Oxford. And there, the philosophy, the curriculum is all based on Bible and Christian knowledge. But some professors saw the work of Averroes or Ibn Rushd. Averroes is the English Western name. And he has interpreted, expanded on Aristotle, preserved the knowledge, said this is right. So they use him and his interpretation as the basis for fighting the Catholic Church. They changed the curriculum in the University of Paris and Oxford and created an entirely new movement of rationalism. Which is why, if you ever go to Vatican, have you been to Vatican? This is a good place to go once in life. You'll find that this is a very famous fresco of Vatican called Academy of Athens. So you have Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, all the Greek philosophers, but there is a Muslim in there. This is the height, this is the citadel of Christian thought, but they have space for a Muslim. You know who this Muslim is from this painting? Fresco. This is in the center of Christian religion. This guy, number 5. So he has his place in the pantheon of Greek philosophers and intellectuals. So which you have Aristotle number 15, Plato 14, Socrates 12, and various other people, Ptolemy, but here is Averroes, or even Rushd. Because the Christian intellectuals later came to accept that without this guy, we could not have revived the Greek knowledge or expanded on it. This is Muslim contribution to the world. People forget. Without this contribution, the Renaissance would be impossible, just like China, but to some greater degree, because Muslim world was much closer to Europe than China was, because Spain was Muslim, and Sicily was under Arab rule. So there's much more direct contact between Arabs and Muslims and the Christians. The Crusades, class of civilization in one sense, but also transfer of knowledge. It was during the Crusades that a lot of Christians and European intellectuals got to see places like Alexandria, places like Baghdad, places like Damascus, places in Anatolia. And they said there's such huge amounts of knowledge. Some of it is surviving from Greek. They've all heard of Greece, but they haven't read anything. Because these texts are not available in Oxford or Paris, in the big universities. They see all this knowledge, they said, okay, we translate. So they get the patronage of people like the King of Sicily or the kind of equivalent of House of Wisdom in Cordova in Spain. And they retranslate from Arabic to Latin and French. And ideas of medicine. The most popular text of medicine in Europe until 18th century was by a Persian Muslim polymath. Perspective art. We talk about Renaissance art of perspective. Optics. It was by an Arab, invented by an Arab, which the Renaissance artists studied. There is a book with annotations from Renaissance artists in the Vatican Library, where you can say the book is written by an Arab. So you can get a lot of evidence of how Arabs contributed to Western civilization in science, mathematics, chemistry. Arabs were pioneers in chemistry. And navigation. Arabs linked Spain with Indonesia through India and through Egypt. That was globalization, really. A lot more trade passed through the maritime. The Silk Road is important, but Silk Road did not really carry that many goods. The maritime traffic carried a lot of goods. There will be Malacca, Venice, and all these places are connected by this maritime road. Is basically a Muslim road. And people forget that Prophet Muhammad was actually a trader. The Muslims have nothing to do against trade. Very rational philosophy, make money. market economy, and very capitalist in that sense, long distance trade. So Prince Charles, who was the heir to the throne in England, United Kingdom, once said in a speech, the contribution of Islamic Spain. Many of the traits on which modern Europe prides itself came to it from Muslim Spain. Diplomacy, free trade, open borders, the technique of academic research, anthropology, etiquette, fashion, various types of medicine, hospitals, all came from the great city of cities, Cordova. Hospitals was an Arab invention, the idea of a hospital. So when we talk about this today, we think of Islam as a terrorism. And the West has a very jaundiced, negative view of Islam just because of certain groups of people. There are extremist groups in Islam. Islam is not what it was once before. But at the same time, there are a lot of moderate and progressive Muslims who renounce terrorism, violence. And there is a very rich culture and contribution from them to the West. If we keep that in your mind, you will think there is a common ground. The civilizations don't clash, they learn from each other. Muslims also learned a lot from Europe, but that came in the 18th, 19th century. The idea of European Enlightenment affected the Muslim world. In Turkey, for example, Turkey's modernization happened partly influenced by Europe. Egyptians, reform movements, nationalism in terms of fighting against colonial rule. Europe did influence Islam, but Europe itself benefited from Islam earlier on. It's just a two-way process, mutual learning. So there are some scholars like Niall Ferguson, a British historian, who would argue that Europe, basically European civilization, the West rose on its own. It basically on its own merit, on its own wind. It didn't really have, he has a book called Civilizations. It is all because of what he calls killer apps, that medicine, science, consumer society, work ethic, agriculture, competition, all this came from Europe, and Europe went ahead of Asia on its own. But he forgets, and this is why I have been critical of him, and I had a debate with him in Beijing when both of us teach together at the Tsinghua. When I said, you forget all these prior contributions. So what it tells you that there's no question that the Islamic world or Chinese and Indians learned from Europe. But before they learned from Europe, they also taught a few things to Europe. So every civilization advances by learning something from the previous civilization. Same is true of Greece, which learned from Sumer or Egypt. Same is true of Islam, which learned from Greece. Same is true of West, which learned from Islam. Same is true of other civilizations learned from the West. And now may be a time when we have the West is learning few things from non-Western civilizations like China or India in science, technology, and other ideas. So the study of civilization tells you a lot more about what we know about international relations. And the world order concept helps you to get out of this Eurocentric mindset and the complex that everything the West did was great and permanent and universal, and the East was sort of a laggard, backward learner, passive learner. The history is much more complex, and it also helps you to challenge the class of civilizations. That civilizations are classy with each other. A lot of this was voluntary mutual learning. There was some force, some violence, so one cannot go from one end to the other end. But the thing is, it's a much more complex situation. It's a two-way learning process. And without keeping that in mind, you get a very one-sided view of what civilizations, how they encounter each other. And given that world order is a broader concept than international system, it has ideational elements, knowledge elements, and material elements, political institutions, economic globalization, if you look at world order in terms of economic, political, and knowledge elements, you'll find that these previous world orders have some vibrancy and they have rich legacy for the modern world. So, I conclude by some key points. The contribution of civilizations should be judged relative to their own time and space. Now, today, the Islamic world has fallen behind, or the Indians have fallen behind. Doesn't mean they're always like that. So you should judge them on the basis of their own time and space. Just like the West was in dark ages when the East was in golden age. That doesn't mean we disparage the West because it was in dark ages. Similarly, we should not disparage the East because it is now fallen behind, although they are catching up now. And civilizations are not singular or monolithic. No civilization is like only one-dimensional. So I told you, every civilization has anarchy, hierarchy, idealism, realism, rationalism, and mysticism. Different stages, they have some elements more than the other. The Greeks also had mysticism. Indians have rationalism. So no civilization is singular or monolithic. They combine all these elements: rationalism, mysticism, realism, idealism, anarchy, and empire. Circulation of ideas. How ideas, I give you the classic example. Greek ideas preserved by and advanced by Arabs, feeding into Renaissance, feeding into the right of the West. Indian ideas circulating to Southeast Asia. Indian religion circulating to China, from China going to Korea, Korea to Japan. And this is happening entirely peacefully. The model is different from Hellenization, the Indianization model. And finally, civilizations do not do clash. I'm not saying they don't. We always have the Crusades. They are real. But the Crusades also are an important learning moment for the West. Without the Crusades, we won't probably have a Renaissance. So, in fact, you will find that if you look at the history carefully, one cannot do a statistical comparison, but you'll find that there are more examples of peaceful learning than violent encounter among civilizations. And but learning, whether with or without violence, learning is the key trend in civilizations and world orders. So when we look at today's world, when it says Western dominated, and all the ideas and institutions we have, today's international system or world order, is American world order. It's a combination of European and American world orders, basically what we have today. But that was never the case historically. Historically, we had other world orders. So have some respect. And those world orders are not going to revive itself like the Chinese tributary system. But they will continue to be used by elites, or they will continue to inform the world view of these civilizations, to the extent that like China and India are the two largest countries in the world in terms of population. And in terms of economy, predictions are that China and India will become number one and number two economies by 2050. So how can we not study their past or their worldviews? How can we study international relations without knowing about the two big civilizations of the past and the future, even though they have fallen behind in the last 400-500 years? And if you look at political system, talk about democracy, human rights, they are all very good. But the fact is that they have not been all that universal. In fact, the way to make them universal is to say they have multiple origins. They're not Western to be imposed on the rest, but human rights and democracy or republics have multiple origins. So every civilization had elements of them. That's the way you propagate them. That's the way you convince the world that, look, these are universal because they have multiple origins. They're not universal because they started in Europe and everybody should accept it. It's bad to do that from even a marketing point of view. You do marketing. If you tell, market something, they say that, oh, this was invented in America and it's something completely different from your culture, you accept it. That's one way of doing it. But another way of saying that, look, now we can localize it. Like McDonald's goes to India, has because Indians don't eat beef, so they have a lamb burger. Localization is a very time-honored principle of marketing. You sell things by telling them this is similar to what you have before. And that's a better way of promoting world order today. And also dismiss this very paranoid idea of class of civilizations, because it's not true. So that's what you get from learning from civilizations and world orders before the rise of the West. And then next class lecture I'll talk about the more contemporary period of Westphalia and onwards from there.